Welcome to this inaugural game of Carnage and Glory II on the channel. It's a computer moderated rule set created by Nigel Marsh, and pictured in the background here are the forces that will be engaged, and in a moment I'll also show you the orders of battle. Bear with me as we go through this. There are some teething problems, but I'd already shot the footage and then identified the problems afterwards, and I've done my best to show you throughout what I'm seeing from the system. I have the 2014 version as depicted here. I have very recently updated to the most recent version of Carnage and Glory II. These are the orders of battle. This is the Italian order of battle for this, and as you can see, the orders of battle contain a wealth of information on the units, some of which isn't displayed here and you can activate separately. The only other information that will be of particular use for the purpose of this is that I'm using the ground scale of 1 inch is equal to 25 paces. So welcome to the battlefield for this inaugural game of Carnage and Glory II on the channel. As you can see, I've already gone ahead and deployed the two sides. So on the left hand side of the battlefield here, the Prussians, who will be defending this T-junction, have got the 3 battalions of the 1st Italian Landwehr there, drawn up in column with their skirmishers out to the front. Just next to them, behind the hedge, the brigade commander, Graf von Lindenau, is just observing matters. And then on their left flank, the 2 battalions of the 2nd Neumark Landwehr Regiment are moving up. And that's their regimental commander in front, indicating what's going on. And then there's the Silesian regimental commander just there. On the opposite side of the field, so here we have the Italians drawn up. There's an Italian half-foot battery here just behind this hedge, already deployed. And then you've got the 3 battalions of the 7th Italian Line Infantry. So the 3rd battalion here in march column, just about to emerge from this orchard area. And then the 2nd and 1st battalions of the 7th Line, led by their colonel with their skirmishers in front, and with the Milan Guard battalion just behind. And there's the brigade commander, General Moroni, about to lead their troops forwards. So in terms of the mission as described, in terms of terrain objectives, the Italians need to gain the line of the road here and drive the Prussians off this junction. They can either do that by simply capturing it and holding it when the amount of time runs out, or by breaking the Prussians and driving them off by inflicting enough casualties to destroy their morale and send them packing. So bear with me as we go through this. It's not immediately obvious how to intuitively show a computer moderated game, but I'll do my best in the turn and sometimes turn phase roundups once describing what's going on, to also flash up screenshots from the system to give you an idea of what I'm seeing when I describe what's going on with the rule system. So without further ado, we'll go ahead and carry out the move for the first turn. So the game is starting at 10:30, the conditions are clear and the ground is good, there's no soft ground in this, and the French side, or in this case really the Italians, have the initiative, so they will move first in the movement phase. So at the end of the turn 1 movement phase, the Italians have all advanced. The 3rd battalion here moved out of the opening from the orchard and shook out from march column into double company column. The 2nd battalion has come up alongside it. It could have moved further, up to 450 paces, but only used about half of that, just to keep alignment, and also because on the right hand side here, the 1st battalion chose to enter this area of disruptive terrain, these ploughed fields, which required a formation change input, as shown here. And as you can see, it limited their movement, and that's actually as far as they could get due to the disorder of moving through that terrain. The various generals then moved to different locations, and the Prussians here The only significant movements were that the two battalions of the Neumark on the far side there, the leading battalion has swung round to the left and tried to form itself into company column, and behind it the other battalion is still in march column, preparing to follow it to deploy on the Prussian left flank. And then here, this battalion of Silesians has just sidestepped slightly to give the front row a bit more room to shake out into line in order to meet the approaching French, if necessary. And apart from that, there's been a little bit of shuffling of commanders. So with that, there's no small arms fire for the firing phase. However, the Italian half-foot battery will open up some preparatory fire to support the infantry attack as it develops. A correction to the firing phase: the half battery here cannot open fire because what I neglected to do was to select its pre-game formation status as deployed. So technically it still counts as limbered, and I cannot go back and input that now, so it'll have to remain limbered and deploy in the next turn, which means actually it ends up not supporting this attack at all, because the infantry are probably about to obscure its field of fire. So we will go on and run through the rest of the turn phases. So with no close combat, we went straight through that phase. We went through the rally phase, then no rallying was required to be done, and then there was the end of turn administration phase. Nothing took place in that. So straight on to the 10:30 turn 2. As you can see, this is the morale state of both sides. And in addition to that, there was a prompt to suggest that General Fontanelli, who is accompanying the Italians as their division commander, who's alongside the battery over here, is inspiring the men by his example, according to this. So we'll move on to the movement phase, and the Italians retain the initiative, so can choose whether to move first or second. And in this case, I think they're going to have the Prussians conduct their movement first. There are no charges going to be declared by either side, so it'll just be the normal movement to be carried out. So this is the situation at the end of the movement for turn 2. As you can see, the sides have closed up quite a lot, which they will do pretty rapidly at this scale. I need a much bigger table to slow that down. But as it's only a tactical engagement, it doesn't really matter. So the Italians have moved right up. Correction to earlier, it's the 2nd, 3rd and 4th battalions. It's not the 1st, 2nd and 3rd. So on the right-hand side over there, the 2nd Battalion, crossing more disruptive terrain by clearing the rest of that field, has incurred a bit more fatigue for doing so, and has been logged by the system, and is confronting 2 battalions that have burst into the field there of the 2nd Neumark Landwehr. The battalion that was already in company column simply wheeled to the right and crossed the fence, and then the following battalion has moved around in march column and come in through the gap in the fence. However, they're both currently disordered under the system log because they're in disruptive terrain and, in that case, cross the fence. Then this battalion here, the 2nd Battalion of the Silesian Landwehr, has just moved over the road and deployed into line ahead of the oncoming Italian 3rd and 4th Battalions, and the skirmish screens are now about to meet as they've moved into range of each other for some shooting in the fire phase, or the firing phase rather. So we shall move directly on to the firing. So in the firing phase for turn 2, the Italian foot battery opened up on the 1st Battalion of the 1st Silesian Landwehr, which is the one just behind the hedge, at a range of 750 paces, and as it's their first instance of firing at the unit, the system's taking into account the fact that the artillery are finding their range, and I also had only half of it fire in order to preserve the fatigue of the gunners whilst they try and find the range. Despite that, they managed to inflict 20 casualties, as you can see here, on the Landwehr, which was not too bad for half a battery firing for the first time and trying to get the appropriate range to hit the Prussians. In the centre, the 3rd and 4th Battalions of the Italian 7th Line, their skirmishers engaged the Landwehr's defensive skirmishers and inflicted no losses despite both battalions being engaged. And that was all of the firing for turn 2. So with no close combat and no significant rallying to be done at the end of turn 2, we move on to turn 3. In the automatic morale checks done at the end of the turn, the 1st Battalion of the 1st Silesian Landwehr, that's this one here, was automatically checked as it had been under artillery fire, but the result was that they would continue as ordered, at least for now. So we've moved on to turn 3, which is the 10:45 turn, and as you can see, the 2 infantry lines have moved within a few hundreds of paces of each other now, so there's some decisions to make. The Italians, the 2nd Brigade, the 15th Division, still have the initiative, and so they'll have to decide what course of action they wish to take. So they could try and drive in the skirmishers and break down the Prussians with some skirmishing this turn. They could go straight ahead and just try and charge and drive the Landwehr off, which would be a bit more audacious. So some decisions to be made, whilst the Prussians meanwhile try and hold them up and try and drive them back from the road. So after the moves, you can see here that the 4th Battalion of the 7th Italian Line Regiment has moved up on the left to screen the fact that in the centre there, the 3rd Battalion has gone straight for it, just going ahead to try and drive this Landwehr Battalion off the line of the road. From the get-go, they passed their system-initiated morale check to close with the Prussians. They've halted just at point-blank range because they'll have to receive fire before the close combat phase, and that may affect whether or not they actually engage with the Prussians. Apart from that, the Milan Guard battalions moved up into sort of a brigade reserve area, along with the brigade commander there. And then on this side, the Italian 2nd Battalion has deployed into line to protect the Italians' right flank along this fence, and then the 2 battalions of the 2nd Neumark Landwehr have moved up in column now into the field with the possible intention of trying to drive in the Italian flank and finding themselves up against the skirmish screen for now. But the only reason they haven't gone straight in is to try and get both battalions alongside each other before they engage. So now what we'll do is go ahead and do the firing. So after the firing, the Italian artillery continued to blaze away here at the 1st Battalion of the 1st Silesian, and they suffered a further 32 casualties, which sounds like quite a lot, but the turn is meant to represent about 15 minutes, so they're sort of standing there under prolonged artillery fire, getting battered. The skirmishers of the 4th Italian Battalion, that is going to be a consequential rhyme every time, as is that, brilliant. Anyway, their skirmishers inflicted no losses. On the far side, the French skirmishers there inflicted some inconsequential losses on one of the Landwehr battalions. And in the centre here, the 2nd of the 1st Silesian had to take a morale check as it opened fire and stood its ground, but was inspired by the Oberst leading them, and they fired at slightly reduced effect as a result of their morale penalty, however inflicted 26 casualties on the incoming Italians, and we shall see how that affects their chances in the combat phase. So after that combat, as you can see here, the 3rd Battalion of the Italian Line Infantry has pushed the 2nd of the 1st Silesian back. This was the result of the combat, as you can see. Casualties relatively low and equal on each side, but it's one of the things I like about the system in terms of the narrative here. Clearly, as the Italians have closed, the Prussians have given fire, the Italians have come on despite that, slightly discouraged by their losses, and then the Prussians have been sort of driven off as the Italians started to fire into them, perhaps close range, or perhaps some of the Prussians have deserted or broken ranks, and that's why the losses are relatively low, because the Prussians' morale has wavered and they've had to retire whilst facing. somewhat disordered, and both sides have lost a certain amount of casualties, but they've not actually come into hand-to-hand combat. They've sort of been driven off because psychologically they're overawed by the Italians pressing on. But that's the end of the combats for this turn, so we shall move on and do the end of turn rally phase and end of turn admin phases. This is the scene at the beginning of turn 4, so it's now 11:15. As a consequence of the end of turn rally phase and then the compulsory end of turn admin phases, there is a series of actions need to be completed. So fortunately Oberst Kosbach, who's with the 2nd, the 1st Silesian there, was present to try and rally his troops, and this was the result of that. And then following on from that, there are a series of compulsory additional morale checks at the end of the turn, and the system demanded that somebody try and rally the 2nd of the 1st as their morale was faltering. Fortunately for them, their regimental commander is already attached, and so was able to attempt to improve their morale, which he didn't, but it also didn't decrease any further, and they're now under a compulsory movement restriction, the halt, which means they cannot go forwards and they're busy trying to reform their ranks. The Italians that had attacked them, the 3rd Battalion there, they also were checked, but there were no penalties for them as a result of the casualties taken during the turn, and the same was true of the 1st of the 1st Silesian here. Due to having been under artillery fire again and suffering losses, they also did not have any negative morale consequences. So we shall go ahead to the turn 4 movement. The Italians still have the initiative, but it's possible they won't necessarily give it to the Prussians in this turn, but we shall see. So quite a lot happening in the turn 4 movement phase. From the Italian perspective, the 4th Battalion elected to charge in support of the successful 3rd Battalion, and they've successfully managed to close with the 1st of the 1st Silesian, accompanied by Colonel Rossi, apparently only feebly encouraging them to attack, but nevertheless he's gone in with them to try and help drive the Prussians off. In the centre, the 3rd Battalion decided to consolidate its success, given that there are some Prussian supports here waiting in reserve, and elected to deploy into line on the crossroads, which ultimately is their objective, confident in the fact they might be able to shoot the Prussians off the map, but we shall see. The Prussians there remain accompanied by Oberst Kosbach, the regimental commander. Then over here, the 2nd and the 2nd Neumark, both its battalions, the 1st and 2nd, have elected to charge alongside each other, crossing the disruptive terrain as they did, which disrupted them and reduced their movement and impetus of the charge, but accompanied by the regimental commander, and they're going to try and see if they can overcome the 2nd of the 7th Italian line here at the fence and try and turn the Italian flank. So that is all of the movement, and the Milan Guard battalion there, still in the centre in Brigade Reserve. That's all of the movement, so we shall go ahead to the firing, as that could potentially have quite a decisive impact on some of these charge moves. So after the firing had been conducted in turn 4, somewhat dramatic turns of events have taken place, as you can see here. The 1st of the 1st Silesian attempted to stand and give some fire in their company formation against the advancing Italians, and the morale check that took place for them receiving a charge, they did that, resulted in them being thrown hopelessly into disorder and retreating 300 paces through the woods to their rear. I've just moved some of the trees out of the way to facilitate that, as they were overcome by the fact that the Italians were aggressively attacking them, and they also lost 33 men who disappeared straggling or threw down their weapons and surrendered in the process. Having moved 300 paces back, the 4th, 7th Italians are obliged to continue their forward charge movement and have enough to contact the rear of the Silesians, who will probably as a consequence end up being dispersed in the following combat phase. But that was not a turn of events that the Prussians needed, considering that their defence of the road is already faltering. In the centre here, these two units exchanged fire with each other and inflicted a small number of casualties on each other, nothing particularly great. Over on this side, a series of morale checks and fire effects were applied. The defending Italians managed to inflict 35 casualties on the Far battalion, the second of the 2nd Wehrmacht, not Neumark, correction, and then the other Wehrmacht battalion suffered even worse casualties, 45, and as a consequence of which were halted by this and elected to deploy into line rather than closing to contact. The other battalion was given an option to do this but declined. The Italians were given the option to counter-attack this Prussian battalion that deployed into line, but obviously declined that because they also need to resist the advance of the Prussians' sister battalion, as you can see there. So a dramatic series of firing and morale results. It's not looking good for the Silesian centre and right here, and perhaps their only hope is that the Wehrmacht regiment on that side might be able to, although it's a thin chance, overcome the 2nd of the 7th Italians and thus change the situation, but we shall have to see as we move into the combat phase. So in the rally phase of turn 4, following the combats, the 1st Battalion, 1st Silesian, suffered a further 39 casualties from the advancing Italians, who suffered none in return and were forced to retire another 150 paces. The Italians now well through the flank on this side. And then in that combat there, in their attempts to close, the 1st Battalion of the 2nd Wehrmacht did close the fence line, and each side inflicted a relatively small number of casualties on each other, I think 15 and 17, and the Carnage Landwehr were forced to retire 150 paces. The other battalion just remains there in what will be point-blank firefight range for the next turn. However, in the rally phase, the Silesian colonel did attempt to rally his troops here and improve their morale quite significantly, actually, doubling it. And then the Oberst in command of the Wehrmacht attempted to inspire his retired battalion and did manage to improve their morale slightly. And so that's the status of the game at the end of the rally phase of turn 4. At the beginning of turn 5, there will no doubt be some compulsory morale consequences, quite likely for the Silesians, as there were no other general officers available to do any other rallying, because this brigade commander sort of stuck here on a limb, and probably isn't worth sending him back to rally that Silesian battalion at this stage. So things looking quite shaky for the Landwehr as we go into turn 5. So at the beginning of turn 5, it's now 11:30 in the morning, an hour has passed in game time, and some compulsory morale kicked in at the beginning of the turn. So in terms of the Italians, there were some compulsory morale checks, but they're all fine to continue with the exception of, in the centre here, the 3rd Battalion, which is now under a halt restriction. Opposite them, the 2nd of the 1st Silesian has gone from halt to no advance as a result of their increased morale. The difference between these two is, on a no advance, if accompanied by an officer, they could still move towards the enemy, whereas on a halt, they cannot move towards the enemy, under any circumstances, even with an officer, because they're busy dressing their ranks, etc. On the far side, the Wehrmacht battalions, as you can see, have both had to retire 300 paces actually respectively due to morale issues, and the 2nd Battalion, that's the nearest one in line, suffered some losses as they fell back as well, as some of the troops gave up the fight. And then the worst thing perhaps for the Prussian fortunes is on this side you'll see the Silesians, the 1st of the 1st, were were given a compulsory retirement by the morale system, which took them off the edge of the board, so I elected to mark them as dispersed. So they have left the table and the battalion itself as dispersed as a consequence, leaving these Italians quite sitting pretty here, holding this bit of forest. But that's the situation as we move into movement on turn 5. So this is after the movement on turn 5. It's not looking great for the Prussians. It is somewhat distorted by the ground scale, of course, because, for example, here, the distance between these two units is 3 inches or 150 paces, which is, would be a reasonable distance in real life, certainly for musketry. Anyway, so the Carnage Landwehr units over there haven't done anything, they're just occupying that ground. The Italians, in the meantime, have, obviously buoyed by their success, gone through their evolutions, crossed the fence and formed back into double company column, and the 2nd Battalion has been joined now by the Brigade Reserve, the Milan Guard Battalion, as General Moroni senses perhaps the opportunity to force the situation on this flank, which is probably good timing as the decision point's also coming up in the centre here, where the 4th of the 7th Italian line has wheeled, done a front to flank change of facing as it's moved into line, and the Silesian Reserve, the 3rd of the 1st Silesian, has responded by doing the same and forming into line, and they're at 150 paces distance as mentioned, which is going to make their musketry relatively ineffective, plus they've done quite a lot of movement. But the decision's, I think, definitely coming here as the Italians now seek to make a push against the Landwehr, whose morale is growing increasingly shaky and have lost a battalion in the defence already. But we shall move on to the fire combat phase. So having completed all the firing, on the left hand side here, these two battalions went at only 50% of the unit firing to reduce fatigue and ammunition expenditure, and because the firing was likely to be low impact anyway, and inflicted a handful of casualties on each other. In the centre here, the Italians inflicted 10 casualties, but then suffered more than twice that number in return, which is quite a significant percentage loss for them, because they're a much smaller unit. Without many more casualties, they could actually be about half the size of the Prussians opposing them if casualties went on at that rate. The Prussians themselves have used about a third of their ammunition and I think of they're down as having second-rate muskets in this case, but due to sheer numbers are just outshooting the Italians at this stage. Over here, some very slight casualties were inflicted by the Italian skirmishers on the 2nd Carnage, who cannot respond because they do not have any skirmishers. And that was all the firing for turn 5. In the turn 6 fire combat phase, basically all over the field, everybody's shooting at each other. So here there was an exchange of a relatively low number of casualties, about a dozen on each side. In the centre, the same resulted, as although the Italians in the centre here, the 3rd Battalion, are in some disorder, which is reducing their fire, the Silesians opposing them in this turn, due to their increasing level of fatigue, their fire has diminished in its effectiveness, so they inflicted a roughly similar number, about a dozen or so casualties on each other. And over here, the Italians have just settled in to let their skirmishers pick away at this shaky Carnage Landwehr battalion that's defending the fence line. And that's all that took place in the fire combat phase. As a consequence of the end of turn compulsory morale checks, there was, as you can see here, a cautionary reminder from the system that Colonel Rossi's 7th Italian Regiment is extremely tired, all its battalions. They've been in constant action, moving in and out of formations, engaging the enemy for over an hour, and sort of command integrity starting to break down as they get tired. A direct consequence of which was that although the 2nd and 4th battalions continued as ordered in the centre, the 3rd battalion here, due to its fatigue and disorders, retired 300 paces as a consequence of that psychological pressure that they're under. And then over here, the 2nd of the 2nd Carnage are in a similar position. They elected to retire another 300 paces behind the hedge to their rear. which opens up a potential slight gap in the line there. But that was the compulsory morale before the beginning of what is now turn 7. So we shall go ahead with the movement in turn 7. And although the Prussians are in a difficult position, actually the Italians may have largely shot their bolt because of the fatigue incurred in being so aggressive from the outset. The only relatively fresh formation they have is there, the Milan Guard battalion. But we shall see what collapses first, the Italians from exhaustion or the Prussians from a lack of morale. So after the movement in turn 7, Oberst Kosbach has led his 2nd to the 1st Silesian forwards. Despite them being under no advance, they can do that because he's accompanying them, and they've reoccupied the line of the road and pushed their defensive skirmishers back out. Here, in a let's say last-ditch attempt to save the Prussian flank, the brigade commander, Graf von Lindenau, has joined the 3rd of the 1st Silesian, who are also under no advance, and ordered them to charge in line into these Italians. The hope being that even if this doesn't go terribly well, the sort of losses and pressure will have enough of an impact on the Italian morale to perhaps see them retire anyway and hopefully buy some time on that flank. And you see Colonel Rossi is still with the 4th, the 7th Italian. And then over here, the Milan Guard battalion advanced over the fence and occupied the hedge, pushing their skirmishers out to confront the Wehrmacht. And on that side, the extremely tired 2nd to the 7th Italian line has just moved over slightly and have moved their skirmishers over to confront the other Wehrmacht battalion. So the firing in turn 7, the Italian battery down here, remember that it's had its line of sight blocked for most of the game, has taken the end of this Prussian line under fire and inflicted some casualties. The skirmishers inflicted basically no casualties on each other, and over there the various Italian skirmishers picked away a few men here and there from the Landwehr. Here, the most interesting of the firing and combats take place. The Italians were greatly inspired by the presence of Colonel Rossi, stood and fired at full effect and inflicted 48 casualties on the incoming Landwehr, who were given the option to return fire as part of their charge, which they did, inflicting a couple of dozen casualties themselves. But the consequential morale result of that for them charging was that the advance faltered at 50 paces, and they'll now be stuck in a firefight with the Italians on that side. But as a result, there's no close combat to be resolved this turn. So it's now the beginning of turn 8, so it's 12:15. The battle's been going on for an hour and 45 minutes in game time. And as a consequence of the end of turn compulsory morale effects, I've just noticed that the 3rd, who have had to retire once again, didn't take their skirmishers with them. But despite General Moroni, the brigade commander, attempting to inspire them, they have retired further due to their fatigue and general morale state. And the same happened again for the 2nd of the 2nd Wehrmacht over here, who fell back across the field. And almost 70 men, I think it was 69 men in total, threw down their weapons and dispersed or straggled or surrendered. So they're not in a good way at all. Apart from that, the system flagged up that Colonel Rossi's command, the 7th Regiment, all 3 battalions of it, is now unable to advance voluntarily. That is to say, only the battalion he's attached to now can advance, or, well, indeed, the 3rd could advance with the brigade commander. But they're stuck in their various positions because command integrity is broken down due to fatigue and losses, etc., and the confusion of the battle. And there was a cautionary indicator for the Milan Guard battalion, because their battalion commander, Chef de Battalion Varese, although not represented in the game, is in the order of battle, and it was flagging up that the Milan Guard battalion is starting to tire as well. So it, at a critical position here for both sides still, as things hang in the balance. So here we are at 12:30 in terms of game time, after 8 turns have been played. Now actually I had all along thought in my mind that 2 hours for an Italian vanguard there to try and drive the Prussians off was a reasonable amount of time, after which even if they achieved it, it would start to diminish the level of their victory because they need to clear the Prussians out of the way to enable the advance of the rest of the division and the corps. However, at the beginning of this turn, the Prussian overall morale dropped to 78% and the army breakpoint is 75, and the Italians dropped to 74, actually getting below their breakpoint. And in a flurry of compulsory morale results, the Italian 7th as a whole were forced to make some retirement moves, and in fact the 3rd Battalion, as you can see at the back here where I've positioned it, suffered some stragglers as well, as they were forced to fall back even further than the rest of the regiment. And they would have been unable, they've been paralysed by their fatigue and losses, to continue the attack further. The only fresh-ish unit, the Milan Guard Battalion in the middle there, were so tired they would have been fixed in place. So you would think at that stage that the Prussians had managed to hold onto the ground and thus potentially claim a victory. However, the Prussians themselves also reached a critical command status, although their army morale breakpoint hadn't been reached, and the 2 battalions of Silesians here were both forced to retire 300 paces, giving up a number of stragglers and prisoners and deserters in the process. And what used to be in this field, before the Silesians, the 2nd of the 2nd Wehrmacht, they routed, they were unable to be rallied, and they routed off the table and were dispersed, giving up even more stragglers and prisoners into the process. So as it stands, the Prussians, I think, are so worn down that despite the fatigue of the Italians, it's a relative draw in one sense. But I think the Prussians would be forced, due to the shakiness of the remaining troops, probably to concede the ground. Although they can take a minor moral victory, that although they didn't inflict many casualties, they absolutely ground the Italians to a halt. And the Italians, for their part, were highly aggressive in their attempt to clear the ground, and sort of paid for that through fatigue losses incurred. This is the current victory status as the game stands, before I ask the system to process the end of battle results. And as you can see, there's quite a few losses on both sides, particularly the numbers of troops missing from the Prussian side, as a consequence to how many men kept throwing down their weapons as order and morale started to break down. And then this is the end of battle screen, and I have to decide whether to award the territorial and overall victory advantage to the Prussians or the Italians. In terms of territorial advantage, pretty much I think the Italians have got there, so I'll give it to them. In terms of victory advantage, sort of to balance it out in terms of the fact that Prussians managed to delay the Italians for the full 2 hours, and anything beyond this would be a diminishing scale of return for the Italians. I'm going to give the victory conditions, despite their losses, to the Prussians, so it's a relative draw in system terms. And that's it, that's the end of the game. Shown here are the orders of battle with the relevant casualties for the units, although please note that the number of missing that the Prussians suffered is not depicted here in the statistics. I hope you enjoyed this first look at Carnage Glory II on the channel. I've already identified lots of things to improve in the formatting and the depicting of the battles, and I will implement those for the next episode. Until then, happy hobbying.